just in case that anyone doesn't realise who Rowan is, he's Senior Lecturer of History at Limerick University, and he's also Visiting Chair of Irish Studies at Notre Dame. And he is co-general editor of the books on 1916, 16 Lives. So I'll introduce you now to Rowan.
This is one year when you want your voice to be heard. It's not every year we get 100 years after a formative event in our long evolution towards Irish sovereignty, unity and self-determination, backed so emphatically by our gallant allies in America, without which there would have been no 1916 Rising. This is meant to be an occasion in New York City to say something about Pearse, to say something about the connections between the countries at that time. And if you're mad keen, you can acquire a book that Amazon at the moment are not in a position to supply. It was launched in Ireland about 3 weeks ago, thereabouts, in the GPO, which itself was interesting because one often doesn't get into the GPO. On the 24th of April 1916, it required James Connolly, Patrick Pearse, Joe Plunkett, and a large supply of 303 rifles to get entry. But the situation worked out for the best. A few words about Pearse. There's been much made about the fact that Pearse's father was English, as if being of a differing nationality can make you any less than what you believe yourself to be when it counts. As a vastly emigrated people with a massive input into this country, we're up there with the Germans as being absolutely, genetically, emphatically part of the fabric of US society. We know otherwise. There are other Irish diasporas. There's a massive one in the UK, there's one in Australasia. Canada is very Irish also. There's exotic ones in places like South Africa, which has been diminished in recent years. There's a very exotic one in Argentina, which I'm hoping someone will sponsor me to go and check out in great detail. I'd be very happy, to put on the record right now, I'd be very happy to write a book on the Irish in Argentina. Absolutely. Now, people from Argentina took part in the 1916 Rising, believe it or not. They attended Pearse's school and Pearse mentored them, but I'll leave that for now. Yes, James Pearse was English, but James Pearse was a progressive, enlightened, self-taught sculptor and all-round philosopher who published pamphlets in favour of Irish self-determination. He was born in London and grew up in Birmingham, and Birmingham, like Manchester, had quite a radical underworld. A lot of it was ethnic Irish, a lot of it was pure ethnic English. These are people who understood that their own country was suffering under a despotic monarchy that was the head of a tyrannical empire and was basically doing bad things to good people all over the bloody world. To say that to denigrate Patrick Pearse's Irishness on the basis his father happened to be English is absurd. But this is the type of claptrap you have to put up with growing up in Ireland. People tend to obscure the maternal line. That can happen because surnames get altered in the tradition of Western peoples, and not just Western peoples. Margaret Brady was not simply a woman with background in County Meath, and even further afield. Her family were Fenians, and Fenianism is the core of the entire project. The notion that Ireland should be a sovereign, independent country, entire of itself, not subject to interest of hostile neighbours of whatever creed, whatever construct, whatever opportunism. Like America, like France, and in the generations that succeeded in driving the British out of this polity, and the generation that succeeded in overthrowing the Ancien regime in France, our own United Irishmen, who also had strong American dimensions, unfortunately were militarily contained. But that aspiration towards nationhood, towards the Irish Republic, the democratic ideal, has never been extinguished. This is referenced, I'm sure many of you know, in the 1916 proclamation. There's only one country named in that proclamation, and that's America. The exiled children in America. And that is some of you and some of your ancestors. And that meant people who were Irish American, people who were Irish born, and people who were pro-Irish in this country. And thankfully, there's always been a lobby in this huge country, the original democracy, that saw the inherent injustice of the situation facing us in our own country. Now, I'm not going to digress to An Gorta Mór. I'm not going to say anything about the original Fenian Brotherhood who became Clan na Gael, and the ab initio connection with the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But let's say this: there would be no rising on the 24th of April 1916 without the re-cementing of the invigorated Clan na Gael structures in the United States of America and a revived IRB in Ireland. And the key names there are some that should be household names in Ireland, and I think one day they will be. But if I was to say Joe McGarity from Tyrone, many Trump people in this city, John Devoy, Kildare background, J.T. Keating, Irish, Chicago Irish. One of the forgotten major Irish centres, of course, is that incredible place up in the Midwest. They had links across to the American South, the Far West, the Pacific Northwest, and particularly strong in what's sometimes still called New England. I don't think that phrase is too popular anymore, but you know what I'm saying. Doesn't seem too English to me, and I've been to Kent. And the last summer I had the pleasure of being to Bath, which is a beautiful place in the West Country, and that's fantastic. Doesn't look anything like Massachusetts to me, pal. But whatever you like, you know, I wasn't there. But the Brady line ignored because it's Fenian, including ancestors, by the way, who fought the American Civil War, and some of them migrated here. Pearse was partly had Irish-American relatives. This is his background. They were privileged, they were successful. They had monumental sculptures. Almost every county in Ireland, and possibly every county in Ireland, has altars or fountain pieces or baptismal pieces that were made in Brunswick Street, now Pearse Street, by the family of Pearse and their allies, I suppose, their business partners. Willie Pearse, Patrick Pearse's younger brother, made a run of that for a while, but he was actually more interested in acting on the stage, and he also gave his life for Ireland on the most unjust terms possible. They never should have executed William Pearse, and had he not borne that surname, it's inconceivable that this would have occurred. They're well off, but they went to the local school, which is often a good idea if the local school is quality. It did. He learnt Irish to a very high standard at a time when it was not part of the curriculum. For the Christian Brothers in Western Row were one of the more enlightened aspects of that particular tendency, and Pearse got a robust, essential education that set him up for life. In fact, he came second in Ireland in the subject of Irish, notwithstanding the fact he was not a native speaker. Now, I am humbled because I can see two old friends of mine in this room, Americans who speak more Irish than I can. So I'll plead non-incrimination on that one. He was obsessed with, and in the best sense of the word, militant about restoring Irish culture at a time it was nearly extinguished. By the 1890s, Ireland had become exceptionally anglicised, more so than Scotland. And people don't make this comparison very often. But the eastern parts of Ireland were more familiar to the English than certainly Scotland. Wales, also a separate case. The Cornish, West Country English, people have their own sense of locality and region. In some ways, we sounded and looked more like the English than they did, right? And that's okay if everything else is fine and there's respect and toleration of your culture. But there was not. There was hostility towards this. By 1900, young Patrick Pearse had not only achieved a degree in languages, something I'll never do. He was a fluent French speaker, which you wouldn't think of, would you? Ever heard that about Patrick Pearse? But he's also called to the bar, as have many people in this room in front of me. And I had the enormous hilarity and privilege of marching with the Brethren Law Society St. Patrick's Day. We were the last contingent in the parade. Not all of us made it there on time, but it was an extraordinary experience. And believe you me, I'm glad I know a few lawyers in New York. Pearse cared for the cultural revival because he believed it was essential to the spirit of our nation. And hand in part with that was not simply learning quite a difficult language, particularly in the way he was taught in his day, but reviving our sense of our own country, to assert the fact that we are a nation, suppressed nation, ignored, unidentified in terms of international politics, but as proud, as ancient, as worthy as any other. And that's all. We never said we're better than anybody else. There are some people who would have claimed during the Celtic Revival, as it's called, that we have a particularly important link with antiquity and lore and language and Breton law and all of that, and that is historically true. But we don't use this to traduce anyone else. The generation of men amongst which Pearse became, by merit, a leader, did not want to impose our language, our culture, our religion of the majority, 80% of the population than anybody else. We didn't want to take anyone else's territory. We didn't want to seize their assets. We didn't want to subject them to any form of monarchy tyranny. We wanted to emancipate our own people in our own country, like America and like France. And when I hear some of the so-called debates that are taking place in my own country, after years of neglect and vilification, vituperation, and hostile things said about a man like Pearse, it begars belief that people will not look at the plain truth. What did they want to achieve, and how did they feel it was necessary to achieve that objective? Well, certainly in the 1910s, and this is a phrase that's redolent in the history of Republican historiography, there was no constitutional path to the Republic. Unfortunately, because there was no democratic entity in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Every attempt to do this by the book was stymied, stopped under humiliating terms. And as we were people who knew something about the consequences of having no representation and overtaxation, and all our affairs determined by a self-elected oligarchical sectarian clique in a foreign country, it mattered. It really mattered. So Pearse was one of those who broke the stasis, who at enormous risk to life and liberty, for which he paid the ultimate price, determined that he would go for it. Now, he may not have felt that way when he was a child, but he said he did. There's no reason to doubt that. But the proof is in the pudding, and he didn't die from lead poisoning in Kilmainham Stonebreaker's yard for nothing. Far from it. He managed to attract the attention of those who were in a position to advance his advanced nationalist, militant Republican agenda, namely the great Tom Clark, the representative of John Devoy in New York City, the key figure in the triumvirate of Keating, and of course McGarrity in Philadelphia. They knew that Pearse was a kindred spirit. And years before he was formally inducted into the IRB, and that is still difficult to say when that occurred, and there are differing eyewitness testimonies about when that occurred, he was clearly identified as someone who would do what had to be done. And essentially, Pearse became the front person for Clark, the PRO of the Irish Brothers Supreme Council, and he became one of their most important emissaries. And that's important, because why was it that they sent an educationalist, an occasionally practicing lawyer, a poet, a playwright, a polymath, a propagandist in the best sense, an educational, pedagogical, pioneer? Why would they send someone like that to New York City in February 1914, within mere months of the foundation of Oglenaheron, the Irish Volunteers, in the Rotunda on the 25th of November 1913? The reason is that Pearse was absolutely, congenitally the right man for the job. He immediately convinced the Devoy Circle that the IRB in Dublin were back in business, that there was a concerted attempt to go for it at an opportune moment, and that they wanted to activate the latency of the revolutionary structures in this country as they existed, which were extensive, well supported, fully legal, and entirely moral in their objectives. Pearse succeeded to a very high degree, to the point that hundreds of thousands of dollars accumulated in listed accounts published in the Gaelic American by Devoy from William Street in Lower Manhattan, under the control of Daniel Spellacy. Pearse liaised with other great Irish Americans like just Cohallen, the Keogh family, and others who had always helped out. And he basically convinced them that Oglenaheron, the tool, if you will, in the best sense of the word, of the IRB, were going to take us to the next level. The question, of course, became when and how, what extent of uprising. Now, Pearse was not peripheral to this. And one reason for that may have been that Sean McDermott, who frequently visited this country and had many siblings who lived over here, domiciled in New York State and beyond, and Dermot Lynch, another man he encountered who thought very, very highly of him, another top-level Clan na Gael IRB intermediary, they knew that the situation of international war was likely, something that obsessed Roger Casement in ways that gave him a slightly different perspective, but we'll leave him for another occasion. Pearse represented the authentic voice of the reformed IRB Supreme Council. From May 1915, he was a member of the military committee. Now think about this. Someone who's nominally only inducted as recently, and some people say this, around about December 1913, and that's the last date possible for him to be inducted to the IRB, by May 1915, is the driving force behind the most secret element of the most secret organisation in the Western world. Now, that is not an accident. This reflects his character, his status, his acumen amongst those who knew the difference. Now, in the meantime, when he was here, he lectured in the Brooklyn Academy of Music, where if you want to get a filming permit, good luck to you. In the Olean Hall, just up here across from the library. He was in Delaware, he was in Rhode Island, and of course he made the homage down to Philadelphia, another exceptionally important Irish centre, to see the extraordinary Joe McGarity. All of those men put their trust in him, and very, very quickly the Clan na Gael structures went into overdrive, and it wasn't just a couple of hundred thousand in the accounts in Manhattan. It was vastly greater sums than that, and the creation of a funding circuit and network that crossed this country and penetrated into the South, believe it or not, that became, I think, the prototype and the backbone of those that paid for the war for independence in Ireland from 1919 to 1921. So there's a longer term gestation here. Now, I promised I wasn't going to do a formal lecture, and I'm tempted to go into one, but I'll save you from this. The shorthand version is this. In August 1915, when the military committee were already coalesced, and it ultimately became the 7 men who signed the proclamation as the Provisional Government of Ireland, that's the military committee, James Connolly being co-opted in January 1916 as the last major person coming in, you'll see accounts like, oh yes, and Clark and McDermott eventually joined. Oh my God. They joined because it became necessary to formalise their status of a committee they're already ex officio members of, and to round out the Provisional Committee because the moment of truth was in the offing. It's not as if they suddenly came in and helped out. People who write about the history of republicanism in Ireland often haven't got a clue what they're talking about. And they haven't done primary research, they don't know the wood from the trees. And of course, it's difficult because we're talking about secret organisations that don't have records or have scattered records. I get it. But Ireland is a country where the most outlandish, stupid comment can get you on the front page of a newspaper, and plain and simple common sense history is ignored. And unfortunately, that's because the business is unfinished due to the partition of Ireland, which is something that cannot be laid at the door of men like Pearse, Connolly, McDermott and Plunkett. He was central to their planning. And what I was able to do, due to the availability of sources that were denied from me in my entire life until about 4 or 5 years ago, but thankfully now are available and you can all see them, the belated declassification of the Bureau of Military History Archive, compiled in the 1940s and 1950s, and indeed the pension files, is if you look for what Pearse did amongst those who had direct contact with him, a view of that man emerges that is completely at variance with the received bullshit that passes for the cipher version of his much maligned modern characterization and demonization. I've said this, if I to say it in one way, consider the man who on the 3rd of April 1916 issues the general orders for mobilisation of Oakland and Heron, the Irish Volunteers, which he knew, and the inner circle knew, was actually going to be the rising, originally planned for Easter Sunday, the 23rd of April 1916. Consider that. Pearse issued that order as director of the military organisation of the Irish Volunteers. He was secretly, of course, one of the 2 or 3 key members of the Military Council of the IRB, and he was the only person with high dual status. Clark didn't need it because he had Pearse. So it's not just about, niceties. But Pearse is the guy. He issued the order. When the push came to shove, and it's a matter of sad history of Ireland, the importation of weaponry from Germany, on a token level, by the way, it wouldn't have been enough to arm anything but a fraction of the existing volunteers, even after the moderate nationalists had heeded John Redmond's moderate national call to go to the front, although most of them didn't actually go to the front, they just dropped out. 35,000 weapons isn't enough for an organisation that had nearly 300,000 members. The rump, as you want to call it that, those who remained Republican orientated under Owen MacNeill, but really under the control of people like Clark and Pearse and McDermott, they're the ones who wanted a sufficient element of the remainder to go forward and do the business when it counted. They felt they could rely upon enough of them to do it. And in the final analysis, the loss of the odd arms ship on Good Friday 1916 did not prevent the rising. It minimised its scope drastically, sure, and yes, that was a major problem. But why was it not insuperable? It was not insuperable because the real agenda of the rising was to mount a coup d'etat in Dublin City, at least temporarily, to have provincial uprisings around the country to give it effect, to enable the declaration of the Irish Republic, much in the way that the American Republic had been declared in Philadelphia, and to gain time for diplomatic recognition of a small nation during wartime with one effect: to inhibit the British from savage counterattack, which they would win, to short-circuit the process of gaining independence by having a token arm showing instead of a massive insurrection, which is probably likely to be preempted by spies and informers, sadly, and to strike a blow that even wartime censorship could not obscure. This is the type of thinking, quite sophisticated revolutionary thinking, that the IRB and Clan na Gael networks were developing. Hence the importance of the proclamation. We don't know who wrote all the proclamation, but we do know this. Pearse appears to have written most of it. Entire phrases are verbatim quotes of what he said in America in 1914, including the very controversial, stirring opening phrase, Irish men and Irish women. There have been those who attempt to portray Pearse as a conflicted, messianic, Catholic-obsessed, demagogue in a back room. Utter nonsense. That is not the Pearse that emerges from his writings, from his plays, from his actions. When they said Irish men and Irish women, in their first significant expression of its kind, in a nation-founding document, they were ahead of everybody. They want to bring in universal franchise, civil rights, religious rights, equality. And those words are all used in the proclamation. Nothing like that existed in the Western world, not in terms of an actual operating force. Did they mean it? Well, over 200 women played some role in 1916, right? Of 3,000 people who played some sort of role, over 200 of them are women. More than 70 of them were jailed. 2 or 3 of them took part in combat operations against the British forces, and many were involved in gun running, intelligence gathering, couriering messages, things that were not happening on the Western Front, or in the Dardanelles, or in Suvla. So yes, it looks like they did mean it, and there's every reason to believe that this was so. They created Common Amon, and my view is that Common Amon was really a front group again for the IRB, and less so the Irish Volunteers. Just look at the people who were in it. They're all connected to IRB Fenian families, nearly all of them. These are people of ideology, of long-term commitment, and that doesn't mean that they wouldn't accept anybody else, but they are the driving force. It's the Daly family, the women of the Daly family. It's the Giffords in Dublin and later New York. These are the people who push Common Amon. They're not the typical young woman, far from it. And just like the IRB, we're not the typical young men, or middle-aged men, or in the case of Clark, would be regarded as an old man. Now, to conclude, what I've tried to do is very simple. To utilise the news sources, to see what's there about Pearse. And I don't mind admitting to you, when I somewhat reluctantly agreed to take on this book in my own series, with Lorcan College and I developed, I was worried that I'd have to be true to my historical sensibility, and if I found things that were not positive, I would be honour bound to at least explain them, or contextualise them, or assert them. And I was afraid that I would find things that would prove that Pearse was the type of cipher and fool that the enemy always said he was. I was very relieved early on to discover we didn't know this. That's not in her book. That's not in his book. They shall remain nameless for this evening. He's a much more complicated, interesting guy. One case in point. It was Pearse who not only issued the orders for what became the Rising. I said that. It was Pearse who personally, on a 1-to-1 basis, as far as I can tell, personally briefed in St. Dental School, Rathfarnham, that extraordinary educational experiment in bilingual educational development, holistic education, personally briefed every county level OC specifically about what they were to do, and gave them each an individualised code word. Now that is significant, because all that means is that Pearse really was at the heart of the IRB. Most of these guys were either IRB or brought into the IRB. 1916 was not necessarily the actions of O'Hearn per se. O'Hearn, as some of you will know, is the IRA. They used the phrase IRA promiscuously during the Rising, a very underreported fact of historiography. Look at what Dermot Lynch said about the IRA in 1916. The IRA is the Fenian Brotherhood and Clan na Gael at war. On active service, they're the IRA. It can mean Irish volunteers, and there were Irish volunteers in this country too, who were linked to the Clan and Hibernian circles. So to conclude, I would simply say this. I'm very pleased to make a counter-argument to some of those who would denigrate a man like Pearse. And I'm using the phrase that Des Ryan used for his fine first-hand account of Pearse. Very romantic, very celebratory, arguably hagiographic, Des Ryan. But Des Ryan fought in 1916, was Pearse's secretary, was a graduate of St. Dennis College, a member of the IRB and the IRA. So Des Ryan knows something about what he's talking. So it can't be dismissed. Pearse, if for no other means significant for his cultural achievements, which were considerable in the Irish language, in defending Irish material interests against English sectarianism, was a key Fenian. He not only wrote most of the proclamation, he read it. The American citizen Tom Clark was the lead signatory, reflecting the huge importance of Irish America in this thing. Pearse was a key member of the headquarters staff in the GPO, and when, due to being pounded by 18-inch guns, 18-pounder cannon rather than 18-inch guns, 18-pounder cannon brought up from Athlone, the GPO in flames, the roof about to collapse, even the granite outworkings of the building being threatened in some cases. He led the rear guard. Now, if you were evacuating an overlooked position, as they were, at times in the line of sight of machine guns and snipers, that's a brave thing to do. Because if you're in the last group, they know they're going to come that way. We can see them, get ready. Pearse directed counter-sniper fire that killed the key British sniper, and he was the last person out of the GPO. He may have been the second last. The truth of the matter is he forgot one guy who was meant to look after explosives cache, went back for him and got him out again. At one point, he was dashing across an alleyway under a line of machine gun fire from a British barricade at the Parnell Street end of the sector, and they were shooting everything they could see, man, woman or child. And I mean that literally, man, woman or child with a machine gun and sniped by the British forces. Pearse went back, despite that, stumbled, was helped to his feet and went on. He was in Moore Street with the assistance of the gallant Elizabeth Farrell, often known as Nurse Farrell. She was midwife, by the way. He personally offered the surrender of the Dublin forces and the national forces on the basis that they'd made that point and to spare the lives of civilians. Now, who was killing civilians? I'm sure the odd civilian, it stands to reason, was killed by possibly indiscriminate fire or accidental shots or overshoots or whatever. That must have happened. Some volunteers were shot themselves by mistake. These things happen in warfare, particularly fighting in built-up areas with troops who weren't necessarily terribly well trained in that. However, it was Pearse who offered himself to Brigadier General Lowe. It was Pearse who issued the orders to the rural provincial networks because he's the only man with the authority to do so. And I put it to you, right there, we're looking at a personal distinction. When the Wexford units, for instance, said, we don't believe this, it can't be true, because we're fine here, a day later, they had to send emissaries up to see him in person. Unless they saw Pearse, they wouldn't believe it. And this was arranged by the British forces, including Colonel French, an Irishman in the Colonel forces, who wasn't a bad Irishman in the British forces. Let's be fair about it. Pearse, when he wrote to General Maxwell, the man who wanted to shoot at least 200 of our people, offered himself as the token sacrifice. He understood that British vengeance would have to be satiated, and in wartime, indeed, by British law, they had committed high treason. Although the points of law are very, very intriguing on this, and Asquith personally had to brief the Deputy Judge Advocate General, Sir Arthur Bucknell, to get to Dublin to look over the points of law in case it became problematic in any form of post-war tribunal. If you're planning to try Germans for war crimes in Belgium, you had to be sure there weren't going to be too many British war crimes in Ireland. Well, there were plenty, by the way. There were plenty. But I'll come back next year and if you'll have me talk about those. So Pearse offered his own life, which is selfless, But for things like this, he's viewed as being a fanatic. I don't see him as a fanatic. I was ambivalent about this project because I was worried what I might find, but I said I was going to do it anyway, and I would tell the truth as best I could define it, with my own subjectivity and human issues, obviously making a big impression on anything I would produce. However, what I found was a brilliant man, a gifted writer, a tremendous organiser, a superb revolutionary, a visionary, and an Irish hero. So on that note, you know he was shot dead on the early hours of 3rd of May 1916 after a secret court-martial. Contrary to British law, he was removed from the place of his execution to a different location and thrown with 2 comrades, Tomás MacDonagh and the great Tom Clark, into a quicklime-lined pit that was ultimately meant to hold 200 Irish people. Ultimately it didn't, 14 was enough, in Dublin, with Thomas Kent being shot in Cork and Roger Casement hanged in Pentonville in London in August. I don't regard that man as anything other than an Irish hero in the mode of George Washington, in the mode of the great American heroes, and the mode of anyone that I think most reasonable thinking persons in possession of the facts would find admirable. So I'll conclude by saying thank you for listening to me. It's great to be able to do this here at O'Loney's, my favourite place possibly in the world. I'm so pleased so many of you have survived St. Patrick's fatigue, because it's become a bit of a marathon for anyone interested in St. Patrick. I feel we have marked Pearse's contribution now. It cannot be said that New York did not. So thank you for coming. Cheers.